Hey everyone, hope you had a relatively safe weekend and are at least in one piece. Basically, we're taking a look at another submission by a subscriber today. This one was from the same guy, Datura Child, who wrote the 25I and NBOME and MXE trip report called The Doors of Perception by Hank Hill. And this one's even more intense. This is basically a hospital trip. Buckle yourselves up for this one. Substances consumed: alcohol repeatedly throughout the day and night, 2C-B orally 30 mg, nitrous oxide inhaled repeatedly, fentanyl intravenous, dose unknown, age about 27 in the year 2017, names have been changed. A few years ago I met a dude at the skate park who had just moved up to Wellington from down south. We skated together into the evening and ended up having a few beers and exchanging stories about our drug experiences. He told me a funny story he'd heard about some fuckwit who broke his arm jumping out of a tree while tripping on DMT. When he mentioned that the person who told him the story was a friend of mine, Steve, I realised that he actually meant 2C-B, and the fuckwit in question was me. I spent that day skating and drinking beer with my friends Andy, John and Steve. Those three are about 5 years younger than me, and are old friends who grew up together down south. We had a really good day skating. Steve and John are two of the best ramp skaters in the country. Andy and I were strictly street skaters at the time, but had a good time trying our luck outside of our element. Inspired by John and Steve, my halfpipe skills improved more during that one day than they had over the decade or so I'd been skating, and I did some shit I never thought I'd be able to. By the time the sun went down, we were all physically destroyed, about 6 beers deep, and buzzing from the session. After our skate, the destination was a party at my flat. Someone's birthday, I think. I was a little bit apprehensive about bringing these three. The circle of friends that hung out with my flatmates were a sketchy bunch, consisting of punks, metalheads, goths, posers, and psychopaths. Andy, John and Steve were rowdy drunks, fearless adrenaline junkies whose egos had been boosted by their status as local legends in the skate scene, but I always liked a bit of chaos, so I was curious to see how it would go. In general, I was a quieter person than them, but they were good at bringing out my inner fuckwit on drunken nights. It would have been about 8 PM when we got to the party. Steve and Andy had a bit of a buzz going, but behaved themselves and got along with my other friends. John was already sloppy drunk and belligerent, and had to talk one of my friends out of beating the shit out of him within about half an hour of arriving. We'd been talking that day about getting some DMT off one of my friends who I expected to be at the party. He didn't end up coming, but my other friend, Ron, turned up with some 2C-B. I explained what 2C-B was to my skater friends, but by then they were all drunk and couldn't get the idea that we were getting some DMT out of their heads. I gave up trying to enlighten them, and we went into my room with Ron to take some 2C-B. Ron was, and I can only assume still is, an odd character. A certain kind of tripper dealer I've come across a few times. Think Jim Barris from A Scanner Darkly. He was a highly intelligent yet reckless trip pusher who seemed to fit somewhere on the autistic psychopathic trajectory. He drifted between benzo, amphetamine and alcohol addictions, and also had a habit of taking extremely high doses of psychedelics. He was meticulous in his consumption of drugs. Everything was measured out to the smallest possible unit, and he had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the effects, duration, onset dangers, interactions, and half-life of almost every drug. He almost always took drugs intravenously himself, just to be efficient. I have no idea where he ended up in the world. He was a strong believer in the brotherhood between drug users, and was always very generous with his doses. But there was a slightly sinister side to this. He seemed to get a kick out of watching people freak out, and often pressured people into taking very high doses of psychs. I could never figure out whether this was a sadistic impulse or a strange, almost scientific kind of curiosity. He decided to give us 30 mg of 2C-B each, and weighed out the doses before dissolving them in glasses of water. It was hilarious to watch him explain the onset, duration and effects of 2C-B to my drunk friends, who just wanted him to hurry up and give them some DMT. In spite of the alcohol, the effects of the 2C-B came on extremely strong and fast. We were all getting visuals within about half an hour. In the lounge, black metal blasted from the speakers, and the room was dimly illuminated by light bulbs someone had painted red. John almost got into a fight with one of my psycho friends again, and I decided we needed to be outside. Out in the night we realised how hard we were tripping. Andy and John got into a completely serious debate about whether or not it was raining. They were both very convincing, and I couldn't decide whose side I was on. My imagination was at least as powerful as my sensory perception. Surfaces felt as wet or as dry as I expected them to. They also seemed to be reflecting light. In hindsight, I can appreciate that surfaces are always reflecting light, as that's what gives them their colour. This is one of many experiences I've had on psychedelics that blur the line between enhanced perception and hallucination. Was I simply acutely aware of the process by which objects absorb some wavelengths while reflecting others? Or was I projecting an imagined sheen upon the objects, causing them to look wet? Or was it actually raining? I'm still not sure. Lights twinkled like they do when viewed through rainy windows. Looking up at the night sky, I could see stars between the stars. The voids filled with more stars the longer I looked. When the sky seemed to be completely illuminated, I wrote the word fuck in the stars with my finger. But then Andy got into an argument about something with one of my flatmates, and the spell was broken. My sense of time was fairly distorted by this point, but after what I imagined to be a little over an hour since dosing, our energy had grown to dangerous levels. I could feel it all building towards catastrophe, and decided that we needed to burn off some of our excess physical energy, and to be in our own space away from the party while we find our groove. So I took my friends to a tree out the front of my house. The canopy of this tree was so thick that you could sit on top of it as if it was solid ground. The foliage was too thick to climb through, so you had to jump onto the canopy from the second-storey balcony across a roughly 2-metre gap. Most of my friends were unable or unwilling to make the leap, but being skaters, us trippers had no trouble making it over. On top of the tree we drank beer and passed around a joint. I turned down the joint, having a general dislike for weed, especially when mixed with psychedelics. For a while we scrambled around the canopy like monkeys, laughing hysterically at the branches dancing in the wind. After playing in the tree for a while, we all agreed it was time to go for a skate. On a whim I decided that I was going to caveman out of the tree and into the driveway. For those who don't skate, a caveman is when you run and jump off of something with your skateboard in your hand, place it under your feet in mid-air, and ride away. The fact that my overly reckless friends were apprehensive about this idea should have made me think twice. It was almost 2 stories down to the unlit driveway, which sloped into the steep hill I lived at the top of. But I often feel more in tune with my body and senses when I take psychedelics. Unfortunately, they also tend to make me feel more sober than I am. We went inside, grabbed our boards, and bounded out into the night. I took a running leap from the balcony to the tree, scurried along the canopy, and jumped into the darkness. My last memory of the plummet was putting my board under my feet. I've been told that I got snagged by a branch on the way down, and took the full 2-storey drop into a crumpled heap on the driveway. I came to a few seconds later to searing pain in my arm. I looked over and saw my elbow snapped completely backwards. I didn't realise I had also hit my head. I'm lucky I didn't die. My friends stood in shocked silence for a moment before asking me if I was alright. I told them I'd broken my arm. They thought I was joking because I said it so calmly. Really though, the alcohol and 2C-B combo made me feel somewhat detached from the pain, and I'd already moved on to a solution-oriented headspace while the stars slowly filled the sky once more. Within a few minutes I was surrounded by a bunch of panicked, wasted people. Andy got into a shouting match with my flatmate again. John stumbled around, almost standing on my broken elbow twice, while Steve tried to control him, saying, "Dude, broken arm." To which John would respond, "Oh fuck, sorry bro." I just lay there telling everyone to shut the fuck up and call an ambulance. Andy told me that once the ambulance had been called, I just sort of logged off mentally and stared into space until they arrived. The ambulance arrived in a few minutes since I lived just up the road from the hospital. One of the paramedics looked into my eyes with a torch and asked me what drugs I'd taken. I tried to explain what 2C-B was to her, but eventually gave up and just said I was on acid. Ron kept trying to talk to the paramedics about my injury in technical jargon, which they seemed to find annoying. He kindly offered to accompany me to hospital, but I declined, partly because I was sick of being around people, but also didn't want to burden the paramedics with the ramblings of an erudite yet socially oblivious weirdo who had probably shot up 2C-B at some point that night. The paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher and gave me a handheld nitrous oxide dispenser, which I took to determinedly. The NOS completely obliterated the pain, and took my trip to DMT levels. Endless dazzling kaleidoscopes and fractals that seemed to engulf everything around me. They had to cut the sleeve off of my hoodie, which was unfortunate because it was one of my own screen-printed designs. It was a silhouette of a man hanging from a noose with his pants down above a fallen chair with the caption, "Coming and Going." I still wonder what the paramedics thought. They loaded me into the ambulance and I melted into my trip. Thanks to the NOS, the ride to hospital was a psychedelic blur. When I came to relative coherence on a stretcher in the nurse's office, it felt like it had been hours since I took the 2C-B, but it still seemed to be building in intensity, though this could probably be attributed to the garish lighting and relative silence of my new environment. Whenever I turned my head, my vision lagged dramatically, like bad stop motion. The nurse's face looked like claymation, and everything else was like a watercolour painting. He'd obviously been told I was tripping out, and was very patient with me, helping me retrace my steps when I lost my train of thought. The alcohol and NOS were wearing off, and I was starting to feel very anxious. I have ADHD, and find being stuck in a room pretty stressful at the best of times, let alone while humming on 2C-B with a broken arm. Though it still didn't really bother me. The pain had come back, and I tried to use that to get more NOS or some kind of anti-anxiety drug. The nurse was sympathetic, but said he could only give me paracetamol. He seemed to pick up on my anxiety though, and moved me along to my own room very quickly. In the private room, I was attended to by two doctors. One, a young blonde lady, who interrogated me about what had happened, which was basically a repeat of the conversations I'd had with the nurse and the orderlies in the ambulance. I got into a small argument with her when she started preaching about the dangers of drugs, and she wasn't very receptive when I tried to explain that alcohol and my own stupidity were the real culprits. The other doctor was a tall Indian man who had treated me about 7 years earlier, when I had sliced my hand open in an LSD-fueled Stanley knife fight with my friend. He observed passively while I talked to the other doctor, and his expression said to me, "Yep, looks like I'm dealing with this drug-addled fuckwit again." But I was still tripping pretty hard, and the door handle also seemed to be judging me, so the dude was probably just doing his job. The female doctor seemed to decide she'd gotten all the coherent information out of me that she could, and then talked quietly to the other doctor for a moment before leading him out the door without explaining anything to me. Alone in the room, I became aware of the sound of a baby or child crying, echoing from another room. This seemed to intensify the pain in my elbow in the form of a nauseating throb. My visuals were still building in intensity, and from my experience of 2C-B, I concluded that this meant it had only been 2 to 3 hours since I took it. This was hard for me to accept. It felt like almost an entire day had passed since I got to the party. I tried to distract myself from the imposing walls and screeching child by closing my eyes and focusing on my injury. I could move my hand and fingers fine, but I couldn't feel the sensation of movement. It was quite bizarre to watch my limbs moving without feeling it. Eventually, the inactivity and howling background noises got too much for me, and I decided to track down the doctors and hit them up for sedatives. I carefully lifted my broken arm onto my torso, using my good arm as a kind of sling, and started to step off the stretcher. As soon as I was upright, the two doctors came through the door and told me off. This set off a paranoid train of thought about being monitored, but this was mitigated when they agreed to give me more NOS. I lay back down on the stretcher and they gave me a small handheld device that looked like a vape, telling me to breathe it in, and then breathe it back out into the device to avoid breathing NOS into their airspace. I kept forgetting to do this, and I treated it like a joint, toking it and exhaling into the room. For some reason, the NOS was much more intense this time. I don't know if it was to do with the alcohol wearing off or the 2C-B trip building up, but I quickly found myself in a completely different reality. It was like a vision of hell. The screeches of the baby were now being emitted by a fully grown man in a suit and tie, chained to a burning tree stump. From the other room, a doctor was speaking in a very gentle, soothing tone. "It's okay, you're being brave. I'm just going to put this up your nose, okay? Very good, you're being so good." This manifested to me as a demonic being feeding an endless centipede into the businessman's nose, whispering encouraging words while the businessman writhed around, screeching like a baby. The vision faded and I found myself back in the hospital room. Both doctors were stood back, watching me pensively. I locked eyes with the Indian doctor and he stepped forward and took the NOS vape out of my good hand, and there was a general agreement that I couldn't be given any more. I have no idea what my body was doing while my mind was in hell. Whatever the case, NOS was now out of the equation, which actually suited me fine. The female doctor told me they were going to give me a sedative before they relocated my elbow. I agreed and motioned for them to get on with it. My memory of this isn't too accurate, but after the other doctor handed her either a syringe or some kind of drip that she then hooked into my veins. Pretty sure it's a needle, but I have a lot of memories in hospitals and the details sometimes cross over. I can remember looking at the label of the hypodermic or whatever it was and seeing fentanyl written on it, followed by a dosage I can't remember. Opiates were the one class of drugs I wasn't into, but I'd never tried fentanyl before, so I was excited to try a new drug, something that had become quite rare for me. I still don't know whether this was a tripped out vagary or something real, but when they shot me up with fentanyl I could feel a kind of tingling numbness travelling up from the entry point at the crook of my good arm, up past my shoulder, before reaching my heart and exploding outward to encompass my whole body. Besides easing my anxiety and physical pain, the drug didn't seem to diminish my trip at all. I was babbling to the doctors about stuff I can't even remember, glowing blissfully with psychedelic warmth. With me now well off in the land, it was time to get to work on my elbow. I was surprised at how ruthless they were. The Indian doctor did most of the work, yanking and twisting my arm around, while the other doctor talked him through it, occasionally providing an extra set of hands for the more complex manoeuvres. I felt no pain at all during this process, but felt like I had a very clear inner perception of what was happening inside my arm, down to the movement of my bones against each other through what felt like squishy pads that sat between my joints. The fentanyl was fairly intoxicating mentally, but its strongest effects were physical, and didn't seem to affect the acuity of my senses at all. It is amazing how specifically it targets the pain receptors. The doctors talked to each other while they were fixing my arm, speculating about the state of it and what to do next, etc. I thought they were talking to me, and I wastedly answered their questions while they tuned me out. It made sense at the time for them to consult me about it, though I'm not technically a doctor. It was my arm, and I was under the influence of a drug that gave me a very clear perception of the inner workings of my body, so I taught them through the procedure, at times vaguely annoyed that they didn't follow my instructions, but generally pretty content to let them freestyle. After 5 or 10 minutes they were satisfied with their work, started building a wet plaster cast around my arm. They left me in the clouds for about 15 minutes while it hardened. When the Indian doctor returned, he knocked on the cast a few times and said, "Yes, feels very strong, doesn't it?" I replied, "What? Me, or the cast?" The doctor chuckled, and I still have no idea whether I meant to make a joke. To my annoyance, they told me I wasn't allowed to go home until the effects of the acid had worn off. By then, the 2C-B trip had dialed down to a mild stimulant effect, with slightly enhanced colour perception, sort of like a moderate dose of MDMA. The fentanyl had now taken centre stage. They were adamant that I was still tripping, and I got into an argument with them about it, angrily telling them, "It's your fucking drugs doing this, not mine." And, even if I was still tripping, I'd be able to walk down the street. You think I'm gonna fucking jump out of a tree again? But it was a pointless battle, so I gave up and closed my eyes, to try and enjoy the fentanyl and the last of the 2C-B. Even though I found its effects pretty boring once the 2C-B wore off, I was thankful for the fentanyl. I'm extremely impatient, and sitting in a silent room for that long without it would have been even worse torture than the centipede and the nose treatment dished out to that unfortunate businessman. The sun was almost up by the time they let me go. To my amusement, my discharge notes included pupils dilated to 9mm in the list of my injuries, alongside about 10 lines of medical jargon describing my fractured and dislocated elbow, several other fractures in my upper arm, and blunt impact to my head. At home, a few people were still partying. They wanted me to tell them all about my hospital trip, but I was too tired, and gave them my discharge notes to read and went straight to bed. I switched on my phone to message my boss and had a few long and disjointed messages from John. The general message he was trying to get across to me seemed to be, "Fuck dealing with doctors like this. Hope you're all good," etc. I messaged him back saying, "Snapped it like a fucking twig." He replied, "Fucking snipped it like a wee fucking twig, mate. Wrist up, bro." The message was so much like his actual speech, it still makes me laugh. I found out later that those three went to John's flat after I went to hospital. John decided to wake up all his flatmates by bowling into their rooms and shouting at them, while Steve and Andy tried and failed to de-escalate the situation. They still thought they were on DMT. As far as I know, they still think that. Steve told me that he completely dissociated while staring at this painting of a boat in the living room, and still feels echoes of his DMT trip whenever he looks at it. Steve and Andy tripped until about 4 or 5 AM before going to sleep. John drank and smoked himself to sleep a few hours earlier, but then woke up tripping balls as the other two were winding down. I kept my cast on for about a week before impulsively removing it. My arm was completely locked in the L shape of the cast, and it took months of physio to get movement back. Even now, half a decade later, I can't straighten it completely. This is complemented by the aforementioned index finger of that arm that I sliced in an LSD-fueled Stanley knife fight years ago, and is also permanently deformed and crooked with calcium build-up from a bad infection. I call it my witch's arm, and like to make this joke where I pretend I'm trying to point at something straight ahead, but my crooked elbow and finger curve around so much that I end up pointing to the left. It was also another bizarre addition to my medical record, which a few years later had grown so strange and voluminous that it got me sent for a psychiatric evaluation. But that's another story for another time. I've naturally grown more cautious with age, as well as by finding focus and ambition to channel the fire into. I do still carry my love of chaos and adrenaline with me, but now prefer challenging my abilities in unlikely circumstances rather than taking reckless gambles. I call it the bet with God. I still disagree with the doctor about 2C-B being to blame for my foolishness. Most people I know who have taken it have enjoyed more sedate activities like nature walks and conversations with friends. In my case, I think it was a combination of the company, both my skater friends and my psycho friends, the overstimulating environment, residual adrenaline from the skate, and of course, the alcohol. The stimulant effects of the 2C-B definitely played a part, but it was the alcohol that caused me to act on that impulse and also fuck up the trick. I decided that opiates are boring on their own, but interesting in conjunction with psychedelics, and also incredibly effective when used for their true purpose as a painkiller. And not at the peak of a high-dose 2C-B trip is a decent substitute for DMT. From this trip, I learned very little and regret even less.